So the thing about this Senior Leaders Aboriginal Mentoring Program was that it was the Aboriginal people mentoring the senior leaders. So it kind of flipped the usual power dynamic in a way that was really refreshing and positive.
Hello everyone, welcome to episode 5 of the Impact Policy Podcast. I'm luckily here joined today by Jim Betts, aka the GOAT, aka one of the finest leaders that many of us have had the opportunity to come across. So it's an absolute privilege to get him to sit here with us, to give up his own time, to have a bit of a yarn about all things sort of values-based leadership, purpose, Aboriginal outcomes, and I guess his perspective and journey throughout his own career.
Thanks, Sam. That was a really nice introduction. Thanks. And straight back at you. It's lovely to be here with you. I always loved working with you, and it's great to be doing this together.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. I was thinking maybe we just kick off by you giving a little bit of a background about yourself, personally and professionally.
Yeah. Okay, great. First of all, I think we're on Gadigal land, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so obviously I want to pay respects to Gadigal elders and to yourself and the other Aboriginal people who are here with us today. I think we're in Annandale, Leichhardt kind of area. Wherever we are, it always was and it always will be Aboriginal land, never ceded by treaty. And pay respects to everyone involved. So yeah, I've got a kind of a weird background. I've sort of travelled the world a little bit. Started off being born into a very white middle class family in Reading, which is a town in the southeast of England, and went to state school, went to Oxford University, where I studied. I was there at the same time as Boris Johnson. And
That's right.
We weren't close mates, I can tell you that.
Not surprising.
Not surprising, no. And then joined the public service in 1988, which is a very long time ago. Yeah. So I've been a public servant for 34 years now, and I just love being a public servant. I tried being a consultant. That lasted 9 weeks, and then I got offered a job back in the public service. Worked in the UK for 9 years, and then I'd met my wife Joanne, who's Australian, when we were on holiday in France, and we got married, moved to the UK, but then I got offered a job in the Victorian government, came to Melbourne, worked there for 15 years, then got fired from my job in Victoria running the transport department. Yep. That happens. The more senior you get, the bigger the target on your back. We can maybe talk about that if you want to later on.
Totally.
In a way, it was a fortunate thing because I got a job in New South Wales at that point. It was in New South Wales for 9 years. You and I worked together in the most recent part of that, which was 2.5 years as Secretary of the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, which was more than just the planning department. There was, Crown Lands, national parks, Aboriginal Housing Office, social housing. There was a very, very broad water, energy, climate change, big department, lots of opportunity. Lots of opportunities make a difference. And that was a big educational experience for me generally, but certainly in terms of working with Aboriginal people and trying to, achieve some belated justice for them. And then got fired from that job as well in October last year, as you might remember. Yep. So I've got a bit of a track record there. And did that consulting thing, tried that for 9 weeks, and then most recently, 3 weeks ago, started as the Secretary. And I've got to get this right. You're going to help me with this because it's a lot. It's a bastard of a name. Federal Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Communications and the Arts.
Whew, nailed it.
I know.
There you
Thanks.
go. Hey?
3 weeks practice there. But yeah, so I've been doing that for 3 weeks. So we're moving to Canberra, and so that's the next big adventure.
Fantastic. What a journey, right? I think one of the things that I wanted to have a yarn about in our time that we were together is that I guess when we talk about values-based leadership, one of my first memories of yourself was I was on secondment at another agency and probably wasn't having the best experience in the world, but I got offered an extension of that secondment for another 12 months to work on, some great work. And I still had access to my DPE email, and I saw your first bulletin come out. And Zoe Kennedy, who's been on the podcast, made specific reference to the impact of that first bulletin in terms of, I guess, how significant communication is and values. And I guess for me at that time, that was I was like, hang on, this is really exciting. This is a leader who I haven't really felt like was talking to me as an Aboriginal person, and to many different people in terms of what the purpose was for why we do our work for the benefit of the whole of New South Wales, and to centering Aboriginal cultural knowledge at the heart of that sort of stuff as well. But I guess I wanted to have a bit of a yarn about what that sort of means for you, values-based leadership, and where that sort of comes from, because it's not the most common, to be honest, that we've come across.
Yeah, it's surprising that there was a profile piece on me that was done in the Age newspaper about 15 years ago, and it described me as Melbourne's wackiest public servant. And if you look up the word wacky, it means like stupid. So there's a lot of competition to be Melbourne's stupidest public servant. I won that prize, and that was funny, but it was also a bit frustrating because if you read any management or leadership textbook, which I don't, by the way, but if you were to, the kind of basic idea of putting people at the centre of things, and that you get the best out of people by giving them an environment in which they feel safe and happy and valued and respected. It's not some amazing thing that I've invented. It's kind of pretty obvious, really. So I get a little bit frustrated that people think my style of leadership is unusual, because it should be the mainstream, absolutely normal environment that people experience all the time, everywhere. But that's not the case.
Totally.
And that hasn't been the case in my career. So if you ask me where it comes from, the answer is it comes from working with some terrible people, working with terrible leaders early in my career. Because for all of us, our first experience of leadership is being on the receiving end of someone else's leadership when we're in junior roles, when we don't have power. We're at the mercy of somebody else who does have power. And I think leaders sometimes are too quick to forget what it felt like to be in that position of vulnerability. But I remember very clearly times when I was a very junior person, and the things that senior people did either made me feel 10 feet tall and I wanted to get out of bed and come to work and change the world, or they made me feel demoralised and miserable, and that I just wanted to stay in bed in a fetal position with the doona pulled up over my head. And I actually had an experience in the workplace about 20 years ago, which was the worst experience, where I did end up being depressed. I ended up unable to get out of bed and crying about silly things. And it came from an environment where it was a very male-dominated environment. The senior people were bullies. Junior staff were invisible to them. They never took any decisions. They wanted to just survive as long as possible and enjoy the status and the big office and all that kind of bullshit, frankly. And it was such a miserable environment that I just had to escape from it. But I kind of made a little promise to myself that if ever I got in a position where I could make a difference, I would be the opposite of those people. And you might have heard me before talk about my strong language warning, my only ever original management idea, which I call anti-mentoring, which is you think of the biggest dickhead that you ever worked for, write down the 10 things you hated most about working for them, and do the opposite. And that's pretty much what I've been doing for the last 20 years. So any organisation I lead, I want the most junior person to feel as valued as the most senior person. Like work experience kid on reception should feel as valued as the head of the department or the CEO or whoever it might be. That people feel there's a strong connection to changing the world, making a difference, whether it's in terms of climate change or intergenerational disadvantage for Indigenous people or street homelessness, whatever it is. In government, we have a huge ability to change the world, so people should feel inspired by that and connected to it. And I want an environment where people can come to work without having to compromise who they are just because of other people's prejudices. So I think that bulletin that you put out, or that you referred to, that I put out early on, was a kind of flag on a hill from me saying, this is what I stand for. We live in a world where there's a lot of manufactured, 24/7 media. People use evasive managerial language all the time, and leaders, a lot of people think leaders are just out for themselves. And I kind of wanted to say, bang, this is what I stand for. If you're an Aboriginal person, I'm on your side. If you're a gay person, I'm on your side, and leave no one in any doubt about that. And I knew that would get a reaction, but I didn't know how much of a reaction it got, both positive, overwhelmingly positive from staff, and negative in some quarters that I don't really care about, to be honest.
Yeah, totally. I think one of the things that sort of stood out as well in those early days was, I guess, DPIE went on a vision and values sort of campaign and process to really lead with values and champion that sort of stuff. And one of the memories I have of yourself and Sally Ann Freelander, who was a part of that, who's an absolute legend as well, was what I really liked was that there was a recognition that, so this happened all across the state. You just went out, you just ran this with staff, but you also created a space for Aboriginal staff to come together and talk about this sort of stuff. And there's two things that I want to draw off from that. And I think the first one was that it was this recognition that Aboriginal culture and knowledge is not a separate piece of work. In fact, it actually builds capacity and strength of an organisation to embed Aboriginal cultural knowledge in ways of knowing, being, and doing every day.
Yep.
And so, and that came through in the priorities that we had. That was one of them. And what I really loved about you in that process was that, you were the secretary, you were in this role, but you sat at the back like a fly on the wall, like no one would have even known that you were there. And you probably think nothing of it, but to be honest, it's actually a real sign of understanding. There's some critical protocols in black spaces, and one of them is being invited in. And for me, you really demonstrated, like, given your level of seniority, you could have commanded everyone in that room to do whatever, they wanted, but you sat back, you let the workshop take its course, and then people invited you in, and you were very conscious about understanding that, that was your place. You were being invited in to provide feedback or guidance or whatever it was. And I just think that was so significant for Aboriginal staff to really feel, one, that cultural knowledge was really valued and significant for everything that we do, but also that they had a leader that was willing to listen and in some ways, from a cultural perspective, to be guided on that journey as well. And I just think that was some of the most earliest things that came out for me. And in terms of, like, you've talked about your personal values and that sort of journey, when you think about sort of structural for an agency or a cluster, like I was at DPE, worked very closely with your predecessor before coming into that role. And, it was a very different world for blackfellas there, and there wasn't a lot of Aboriginal staff. So I got to see two sides of the coin. And so I guess from a structural perspective, do you have any feedback around that process and what that looked like and how important that was for bringing everyone along on that journey throughout DPI?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's really interesting to hear your reflection on that, because obviously, as you said, I was in that room and I wasn't really conscious of some of those dynamics that were going on. I was kind of making it up as I was going along to a certain extent, but I figured I was just probably at the beginning of my journey of being educated by Aboriginal people. I'd never really known that many Aboriginal people. I had a couple of mates when I was down in Victoria and such like, but suddenly I had 500 Aboriginal people in that department, and was getting to meet people and learning from them. And it was as an English person, it was a completely new experience for me. So it made complete sense for me to just spend a lot of time shutting up and listening, and just watching the dynamic within that group and the respectful way in which people, like men, made room for women to talk, and the way in which everybody was accorded respect. And I just wanted to be educated and learn, but I also am aware, I guess to the extent that I was aware was what was going on, I'm aware that with a senior position or a big fancy job title comes a lot of implied power, and that can have the effect of shutting down the conversation because people are fearful, they don't want to say the wrong thing, they don't want to cause offence or whatever. So success for me was to make myself invisible, and of course I wasn't invisible, but to the point where the moment I could sort of sit out of the conversation and people would start taking the piss out of each other or joking or or arguing with each other in a respectful way, that was success for me, because they'd stopped being on their best behaviour and they'd started revealing their true selves, which were great. And so I think leaders are often driven to an extent that people don't realise by insecurity, and that insecurity comes out in their feeling that they have to control everything and dictate terms. And leaders who are a bit more comfortable in their own skin are ready to say, there's more I don't know than I do know. And that cliche about I've got two ears and one mouth.
Totally.
I should spend more time listening and learning than I should talking and directing, because the chances are I know a lot less about what it means to be an Aboriginal person in New South Wales than the Aboriginal people who are sitting here who've had that experience their whole life. So why wouldn't I listen to them?
Totally.
And I just one, and there's a question you'll ask me a bit later on about stuff that I've been particularly proud of, but one moment which might seem a weird thing to be really proud of, I just remember going on the road with the team in the department running a program called Roads to Home, which you'd be familiar with, going into the old, reserves and missions around New South Wales, just over 50 of them, no roads, no infrastructure, no street lighting, no nothing, like terrible neglect, and that team with all Aboriginal people going in there, working in a relationship of equality with community, understanding what community needed, and then going about it in a really sympathetic way, creating jobs for Aboriginal people and so on. And I think we went out to Galaganbone and we went for a cup of tea, and we were sitting in this cafe, and there was Leslie Johnston was there, and Todd and Trent, and I think Jess Herder was there, and a few other people. And I realised after a while that I was just another person in that group, and they were really respectful and all that kind of stuff, but they weren't trying to be anything they weren't. They just were completely natural and relaxed. And I thought, okay, well, that's success for me. I felt really comfortable with these people.
Totally.
Their hospitality, their generosity, their humour, their everything. They have given me the greatest gift, which is just to be, their equal kind of thing. Definitely. In their eyes. That was just beautiful. And
it comes back to that real reflection of what makes a really solid ally, and understanding, cultural capability and protocols is being invited in. And I think that was a way of demonstrating that you had been invited in, and having that relationship and connection with mob there on the ground in Galar, that there was nothing left to, that secretary title, whilst you said, respect and all that sort of stuff professionally, it was all there, but in terms of connection, culturally, personally, that's for me. I think for a lot of us, that's what it really comes down to. And it's amazing work what they've done. They continue to go from strength to strength at Roads to Home. There's some really strong Aboriginal staff there at the moment. I think Hailey Jeffries and James O'Keefe is leading up the director role, I think, at the moment. But I think you're right. Like, it's such a pivotal program for those legacy issues of failed past policies for government. Our people were forced to live on those places, and then those places have now developed really deep cultural connections, even if it's not people's country, but those places have been left, like you just said, infrastructure wise, desolate. So shout out to that team, because they're really doing a significant job across the state in working closely with community, and really putting those principles around community having some autonomy over the progress of that work. That's right. I mean, that was my big learning, and it's very obvious really to Aboriginal people, but to me, that non-Aboriginal people need to, part of the many crimes of colonisation and the genocide that flowed from colonisation, was to deprive Aboriginal people of agency over their own lives. And so that, just as leaders should not feel the need to dominate the conversation in order to demonstrate they're the smartest person in the room, part of the trick of exercising power is to know when to let go of power and give it to the people who have been powerless, and let them determine their own fate and take their own decisions on their own terms. And that's kind of stripping away the colonial apparatus of dispossession, which sounds like a very grand way of putting it, but it's kind of standing on a front yard in Barraville or Condobolin and talking to the people there who are living on the edge of a swamp on the edge of town next to the tip and the cemetery, and saying what would make a difference to you and your kids, and then really listening and then acting with them to put that into practice on their terms. That's insight, that's wisdom. That came from Aboriginal people, not from me. Totally. I was really surprised, because after a short period of time of us knowing each other, I'd thought that, Jim Betts, he seems really switched on. He understands our space. He must have a long history of working with Aboriginal communities in Victoria. And then I said to you, what's your experience or journey been like, or have you connected? And you said, no, it's really started here. Yeah. And I sort of fell off, because I thought, how can someone be so... And I think, again, it comes back to the values in a way of how you lead, because somebody can come in with a really, I guess, early stage cultural capability journey, but if they come with the right values and the right sort of approach, that progress can be really significant. And I think what I want to ask about is mentoring, because you touched on earlier about how you treat everybody the same no matter what level they are, because you experienced the opposite of that early in your career. And I know when we were together at DPIE, we had the SLAM program, the Senior Leaders Aboriginal Mentoring Program. And I think the biggest thing for MOB for us was that it was an opportunity to reinforce it. Like, we might have Aboriginal staff that are working in a 3-4 level. So professionally, they might be at a really junior sort of role. But in community, their seniority might be DepSec secretary equivalent, right? Yeah. And so for us, it was, for MOB, it was really reaffirming that, okay, like, we can put a secretary or a DepSec with someone who's sitting down in a project officer role, and they're on the same level, because it's a cultural relationship and it's a cultural mentoring journey. Yeah. And I know you can't talk too much to other people's journeys, but I've heard some good stories of the outcomes of that. Yeah. But do you want to share, I guess, any reflections around the impact of that for leadership?
Yeah. So just to reinforce what you say, so the thing about this Senior Leaders Aboriginal Mentoring Program was that it was the Aboriginal people mentoring the senior leaders. So it kind of flipped the usual power dynamic in a way that was really refreshing and positive. And like any mentoring thing, it's only as good as the relationships that come out of it. But more often than not, it created friendships and relationships of respect, which continue to this day. So I was lucky to have Tanya Koneman as my mentor, and she'll be my mentor all through my life. She's a fantastic woman, and my friend. And but I had lots and lots of Aboriginal mentors informally. So people like yourself, Amanda McCarthy, Jodie Broon, obviously, who was CEO of the Aboriginal Housing Office, is now Chief Executive of the National Indigenous Australians Authority in Canberra, and we should come back to Jodie because it's quite an exciting time in Canberra at the moment. Right. But like, for non-Aboriginal people like me, coming from a position of very significant ignorance, the first step is to get to know Aboriginal people, to form friendships with them, and what the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment did for me was it suddenly set me up in a position where I could do that easily. I was interacting with Aboriginal people at all different levels in the organisation, just doing my day job. And then I remember having a conversation with Jodie early on where she said, this new department that had been formed, because in government departments get changed all the time, it's been changed since, but she said, if you look at it, we've got land, we've got water, we've got biodiversity conservation, we've got climate change, so we've got air, if you like, we've got country in this department, and you've got 500 Aboriginal staff. Totally. Let's work out, guided by those Aboriginal staff, how we can use all the levers of the department and turn all the firepower of the apparatus of the state government to make a difference for community. And that's how we came up with Our Place on Country, the kind of unifying Aboriginal strategy, which wasn't just about recruiting Aboriginal people into the organisation. It was about making a difference to community so that Aboriginal people would feel proud to work for our organisation, and they would say to their mates, you should come on board and join us because we're making a difference. And if you can, I always said my greatest performance indicator as Secretary of the Department was whether Aboriginal people felt proud to work for my organisation, because if they did, that was pretty amazing given what government has done to Aboriginal people over the last 230 years. So going back to my point, learning and having the opportunity to be educated, because non-Aboriginal people like me are, if you like, they're stuck on the starting grid sometimes. They don't want to cause offence. They bring goodwill, but they start with a lot of ignorance. And so, like, even down to like wearing this T-shirt. First time I wore an Aboriginal flag on a T-shirt, I went to Tanya and I said, it's Yarburn next week. I'm thinking of wearing a T-shirt with an Aboriginal flag on it. Yeah. I was hoping to get my photo taken with Adam Goods, which I did. So
that's right. Yeah.
But I said, how would you feel about that? Would that be kind of false? Would that look like appropriation? Would that look like just virtue signalling? Just kind of, the revolution's just a T-shirt away, as Billy Bragg once said. Is that just make it, false? And she said, no, as long as you don't pretend you're a black fella, and you're just kind of expressing support. Yeah,
100%.
No problem. And I went, okay. But I had to ask the question, right, because I just didn't know the answer to that.
Definitely.
And there was no looking back after that.
It's an interesting point you bring up about the T-shirt stuff. You're known very much for your style and bringing your whole self to work, and the impact that has had on staff culture as well, in terms of people feeling more comfortable to bring their whole selves to work, and seeing that shift. And even for blackfellas, like I worked in Aboriginal affairs, and there was times where like people would be like, oh, the minister's coming in, everyone make sure you're dressed up super nice and tidy your desk and on your best behaviour. And I always used to get really frustrated, because I was like, but that's not how I am. Like, come and see me how I am. Like, we can have a yarn about what's going on. And the people would feel uncomfortable. Knockout would be coming up and mob would want to wear one of their knockout shirts, but they wouldn't feel comfortable to do it because the environment hadn't been created to facilitate that. But yours very much did. And even in the height of like the Black Lives Matter stuff that happened, with the death of George Floyd in America, us in the lockdown here, and the significant impacts that had in terms of reigniting a lot of the ongoing issues that we have here with deaths in custody and police brutality. But to see, I think you came with a Black Lives Matter shirt on or something like that.
Aboriginal Lives Matter.
Yeah, Aboriginal Lives Matter. And like, it sounds, people listen to this and they'll think like, oh, whatever, worn a t-shirt. But like for mob, for blackfellas and, people of colour, I'm sure, that work within DPIE at the time, to see that leadership, just, I guess, reinforcing that support or safety that, something serious is happening here, and our leaders are a part of, wanting to be part of the solution or highlighting that this is significant. It was massive. It was so much. I can't understate it, to be honest. And it's funny. Like, it's just a t-shirt, a number of t-shirts, but stuff like this, it's like they're constant reinforcers of Aboriginal people feeling like we can bring our whole selves to work and feel safe and feel supported, and like you said, you're not trying to be a blackfella, you're just here for it. And it's not like you're just wearing blackfella shirts too, any day of the week you got different band shirt or different whatever's happening.
And partly that's, I feel comfortable wearing t-shirts and jeans. I've no doubt there were a lot of people who thought it was absolutely appalling that the secretary of the department was the secretary was slobbing around in jeans and a t-shirt. And that's fine. There's no shortage of secretaries wearing suits and ties. You can go and work for them if you want. This is just me, and I'm not saying it's a uniform and everyone has to dress like me. I'm saying if you want to, then you can. Then you can dress how you want. And the t-shirts in terms of Black Lives Matter, Aboriginal Lives Matter, always was, always will be. It's partly just the moment I walk in a room, I'm sending a message which is I'm on your side, and you can be. You can bank on me to have your back, kind of thing. And it was kind of simple as that.
Totally.
I did go a bit nuts in COVID and go online and order lots of t-shirts and then forget about it, and then 2 weeks later all these t-shirts arrived. But it meant I had new t-shirts to wear at work. But as you say, it's only a t-shirt on one level, but it's a signal of solidarity, and if that was well received by the Aboriginal people in the organisation, then I'm happy.
Yeah, totally. How challenging was COVID for you as a leader of a massive cluster?
Well, it wasn't as challenging for me running planning and all those other functions as it was obviously for my colleagues who were running health or education or transport or police. So they were kind of frontline emergency services, customer service, who were handling all the public information stuff. They were in meetings. I mean, I was in meetings at 8 a.m. every morning with all the other heads of department, day in, day out, week in, week out. But they were heading out to Olympic Park to be in the crisis centre with the Premier before she went out and gave all the speeches and so on, and the health advice with Kerry Chant. So I had it relatively easy as a leader in the organisation, but I was very conscious that with whatever it was, between 10 and 14,000 staff, depending on when in the period of my tenure, that there were many people in my organisation who were having to homeschool their kids. They were worried about parents or elderly relatives in care. They're worried about community members, particularly in remote parts of Western New South Wales. Parents overseas or family members overseas. There's a time when COVID was at its height in India. A lot of Indian and people of Indian background in our organisation. So just making sure that we were taking the best care of people that we could. But to be honest, that enabled me to connect with people in the organisation in ways that we hadn't done previously. And it's a bit of a lot of people have talked about the move to online forms of communication. I actually relished the opportunity because the need was there. People needed their leaders to be very visible and connected to them and telling them the truth and fronting up and taking accountability and providing reassurance or providing guidance or whatever it might be. It kind of spoke to the aspects of my job that I loved the most. Some senior public servants get off spending time with ministers.
Yeah.
Some love spending time at Parliament. My thing was always my people who work for me. I love them and I want to be there for them. So in a way, I think it spoke to my strengths as a leader, but it also spoke to my preferences. Like, I was able to throw myself into that leadership role, knowing that people kind of needed it and valued it, and that made me feel useful and valuable.
Definitely. Yeah, I think it's definitely reimagined how we think about connecting with people you might not have been able to connect to as clearly before. But even when we think about community engagement, in Aboriginal communities, and thinking creatively around how we can really maximise that spread, particularly when we think about regional engagement and the barriers, logistically even, how we can start to think a little bit more creatively around, how we can use technology or whatever it might look like to really maximise those voices. For us, it's an exciting time with how we sort of see that sort of stuff happening.
Yeah, it does reinforce, though, the need to make sure that we take steps to ensure that everybody has access to that kind of digital capability. We could end up with a very divided society if there are remote communities that are unable to access health services, education services, just access to basic information. And one of my responsibilities in my new job is the National Broadband Network. That puts it squarely on my shoulders to make sure that there's high quality connections to digital information services for the whole of the community, and we don't leave anybody behind in that.
Definitely. That's, your perspective with Roads to Home, I guess, gives you a bit of insight when you think about that stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like, there are some missions where that stuff's really challenging, and that's the level of insight you have coming into a role like that. There are many communities, I'm sure, that experience their own challenges in that sort of tech space. Yeah. But to at least have an understanding of the lived realities is critical.
So maybe fibre connections are the kind of curbs and guttering and street lighting of today. Those infrastructure services that were never provided back then. Maybe we run the risk of going back and fixing up the problems as they were, as they are today, and not thinking about the problems just around the corner. So the Roads to Home team and I were always very conscious that we'd go in and we'd fix up certain aspects of what community needed, but then we'd disappear as government does, and we'd leave behind a whole bunch of unremediated asbestos or no school bus going into that community. And so thinking about what the place needs rather than thinking about what our narrow little bit of government can deliver, putting yourself in other people's shoes. Like, biggest lesson I've ever learned in life is you become a good leader, you become good at your job, you become a good human being if you've got the capacity to see the world through other people's eyes, which goes back to that point about listening.
Definitely. How hard is it, do you think, in terms of government agencies, collaborating on complex issues in Aboriginal communities, for example, or in any community that's experiencing, complex issues or needs? I worked on a program called Solution Brokerage in New South Wales, in Bowerville, and it was the whole of government response. And the previous secretary was leading that, and it really gave us the ability to cut down a lot of red tape and silos and get stuff happening where there was, health, facts, education, like a whole range of services that were involved in a issue to really get some, because that's what so much of our communities say, right? We're experiencing a multitude of challenges and we need a collaborative solution. Yeah. How challenging is that in government? Do you see a future?
I mean, it's challenging, which is why it doesn't happen as often as it does. And you mentioned my predecessor in that role, Carolyn McNally, who really showed great leadership, I think, in bringing all those services together in Barraville, which is a very traumatised community in many ways.
Definitely.
And going back to the previous question around COVID, when the pandemic was at its height, and we're still not out of the pandemic, but when it was at its height, you saw levels of collaboration which were quite amazing across government agencies.
Yeah.
Like, nobody was sort of saying, this is my patch and I'm sticking to it. I'm not going to share data with you. I'm not going to release people to work with you. Everybody just was united by a common moral purpose and a sense of urgency, and we were absolutely intolerant of bureaucracy or silos or whatever else would get in the way of that. And it was the same with the floods, and it was the same with the bushfires, and it was the same with the drought. And you might have heard me say before, if in the midst of those immediate crises we can put aside all the usual bureaucratic, defensive game-playing behaviour, why can't we do that with the slower unfolding crises of things like climate change and intergenerational disadvantage for Aboriginal people? But it requires leadership that is sustained and committed, and that's just sometimes hard to maintain. I remember going out to, where were we? Wilcannia, that's right. I just had this image of sitting in the community hall in Wilcannia with a bunch of Barkindji elders there and community members, and they're talking about the revolving door of government bureaucrats that come through.
Totally.
And we were going, yeah, it's really bad. And then 6 months later, I moved out of my job, and probably another bunch of bureaucrats have gone in there, probably having the same conversation now.
Totally.
So partly in government, because we're always reorganising ourselves and people are always moving around, it's so important in those relationships to have trust. But trust takes a long time to build, and it takes a second to lose.
Totally.
So it requires very sustained, ongoing leadership, passion and commitment to bring those agencies together. But I did feel that certainly while I was the secretary, I know, and it's boring to listen to people banging on about the golden age when they were around, but it's kind of, I felt that there wasn't one person in that senior leadership group in government that wouldn't have dropped everything to help me if I'd said, I've got a community here that needs real help, come together.
Totally. Yeah, that's a good example. Like Zoe Kennedy talked about I don't want to misquote it, the Pride in New South Wales network, the whole of government network for the LGBTQIA plus community. And that was very much, we recognising it was needed within DPIE, but she very much credited your leadership to taking that to sort of Secretary's Board and giving Zoe and her colleague that opportunity to pitch that.
Yeah, well, she did it. She and Bradford were the people that walked into that room with all these scary-looking secretaries, and it was some weird room. Like, we were doing a Secretary's Board out at Westmead, and it was like some weird film studio where they might have faked the moon landings or something. It's this weird warehousey place, and and it was running late, and Zoe had done all this practicing with Bradford, and I remember sending her a text message going, "We're running late. Take it from 20 minutes down to 5 minutes," and she just had to reorder her presentation. Then she walked in and she completely nailed it. But yeah, that was just one of those things where when you are given, like I was saying before, when you're given power, it doesn't cost you anything to open the door for people. Like, it's such an easy thing to do, and people go, oh, it was really the support I gave the Rainbow community. I was never not going to give them that support. Like, it wouldn't even occur to me not to give them that support. And it's so easy to help people.
Yeah,
so why wouldn't you?
Definitely. And so you talked about like one of your most cherished memories as a leader throughout your career. What about some of the most challenging times? Any sort of guidance you might have for people listening in terms of how to navigate that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I saw you sent me that question in advance, and I thought about that. And I think one of the worst times I had, or one of the most challenging times, was when I was running the Victorian Transport Department, and there was a big budget cut came through, and I was told you've got to have to cut your staff by 35%. So it was a huge cut. Yeah. And I was kind of in love with my department. I didn't want to hurt people in my department. I really cared about them and invested a lot in the relationship. So to bring this terrible news to them was a really difficult thing, and I didn't handle it very well. I sat in my office and I sort of held my head in my hands and sort of tried to avoid thinking about it for days. Yeah. And then my EA, my executive assistant, sort of woman called Libby Curtis, came into my office, and she said, "You miserable, sad sack of shit, you've been sitting there for days. You're supposed to be the leader of this organisation. Go out and lead it." Yeah. And I went, "Oh, okay, all right."
Sounds like a good EA.
Yeah, and that's why you need to, give people permission to call you on your bullshit, because leaders need that. That's what, jeans and a t-shirt, not very intimidating. You need people to be confident enough to tell you the truth. And she told me the truth that day, and I went, okay, all right. And the way I managed to frame it was, I remember I'd been on some leadership course or something where somebody had talked about what happens when the ship's sinking and there's only a certain number of seats on the lifeboat. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with that almost impossible moral dilemma? Yeah. And I thought, there's no easy way out of this. 35% of people in the department are going to lose their jobs. But there's sympathetic ways of doing it and there's unsympathetic ways of doing it.
Totally.
If you could, if maybe I find moral purpose and make myself feel better about this if I try to do it in the least worst way possible. And then that led me to think, again, that thing about seeing the world through other people's eyes. How would I want to be treated if I was a person in this department, maybe a vulnerable person in this department, and I knew that there were job cuts coming? I would want the leader to front up. I'd want the leader to tell me the truth.
Totally.
I'd want the leader to go into bat and get me the best options that I could get and then tell me what those options were, and then be flexible and work through what I needed from me and my family so that I could make properly informed choices. And so that's what we did. So I spent day after day after day going into meetings of 10, 15 people in small groups where people had their peer group around them, their support networks around them, and sort of saying, I look around this room, there's 12 people in this room, there's only going to be 9 on the other side of this process. But there's a voluntary option there. If you want to take a package, you can. It means you can't work for government for another 6 months or whatever. Yeah. But you might cash out and you might get your leave and you might go on a course and you might go overseas and you might do this and that. And people did. One person won MasterChef that year.
Okay.
It's pretty amazing. But that was a really tough time. But it was a time where I went from thinking there's no vegetarian option on the menu, this is just awful, there's nothing I can do about it, to thinking, actually, I'm going to do this in the least possible, worst way possible, if you like, and I'll make it my mission to do a difficult task as well as it can be done for my people.
Yep.
And that's how I got through that.
And so would you say the critical things for someone to take away in terms of having to manage difficult conversations would be things like putting themselves... You said something that stood out in terms of how would I like this to be told to me? Yeah. I would like my leader to front up. Yeah. How would you sort of spell it out in terms of a key point for someone to take away?
Yeah, so I think if you're dealing with you're having a difficult conversation with somebody, say maybe they're underperforming a bit. Mm-hmm. If I'm underperforming in my current role, I'd like to know about it early. Mm-hmm. I may think it's unfair, and I might push back, and I might choose to ignore it, but I want to be given the chance to hear that in a sympathetic way without any kind of loss of dignity, so that I've got time to try and turn it around and do something about it.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think most of us would probably feel that way, however confronting it was to have that truth told to us or that message delivered to us. And as the person delivering the message, and I have had to be in that situation, I've had to fire people, I've had to do things which make my palms sweat and my heart beat in my chest, the moment you don't feel awful about it, you've lost your humanity. So totally. Don't beat yourself up for feeling awful about it. But thinking about how the other person will receive the message, and then making sure the message is as well delivered and thought through as you can make it. Because if you use the wrong word in the moment, you can either pull your punch and not deliver the message that they need to hear, or you can use language which will hurt them unnecessarily. Mm-hmm. So if I'm having a difficult conversation with you, I would write down what I want to say to you, and I would think about it, and I would change this word, change that word, maybe change the order of it until I've got it to the point where I could say, okay, well, this is giving you the message in the fairest, most direct, but also most sympathetic way, which gives you the best chance of getting out of the room. And I probably think this is going to be a really tough thing for you. You might become emotional. Yep. You might want to take a break. You might not hear anything after the first sentence because your brain starts... And I've been in that situation. Like when I got fired in Victoria, it was 8:15 in the morning, walked into the Premier's office. It was pretty scary. I sat down as the Premier, Chief of Staff, the head of the public service, and they were there to say, we're doing a big machinery of government change, and we're moving the departments around, and unfortunately there'll be no job for you on the other side of it. And he would have talked for another 5 minutes, and I didn't hear a word.
Yeah, wow.
So I thought, okay, I can imagine other people feel the same way. So they don't want to be sat there for 5 minutes. They want to have the chance to go out, maybe, slam a door, shout, have a cigarette, whatever they want to do.
Totally.
So thinking about how you can give them the options to manage themselves with dignity is a really important thing.
Definitely. You touched on something earlier, if I can ask you about it, and you talked about a really hard time you had earlier in your career around mental health and well-being. You had a really, not positive experience that triggered some depression, and mental health and well-being is something that we're really passionate about, particularly around self-care and all that sort of space. But if you're comfortable, I'd love to just hear how you navigated that journey, and any advice for people that might be dealing with the same sort of thing or have been.
Yeah, it was really hard. At my low point, as I say, I could barely get out of bed in the morning. And there are many people who have many worse experiences of depression than I do. Yeah. And mine was, at least I had a reason for mine. It was the work environment, which meant that at least I could figure out that if I changed my work environment, then I might do something about my depression. I might be able to make some progress. Whereas for other people, it just descends on them, and there's not a single thing that they can change, obviously, to alleviate that. So it took me 2.5 years to come back from that episode, because what depression does is it robs you of your self-belief. Mm-hmm. It makes you feel that you're useless and you are worthless and that everything you try will fail. And why would you ever think that anything's ever going to work for you, because you're a loser?
Totally.
And that's a terrible negative voice to have in your head. So the first thing I needed to do was to escape from the work environment that was causing me that level of misery, and that gave me a chance to begin to rebuild. But it was from a pretty low base, and as I said, it took me 2.5 years of finding new people to work with, and then one day someone would say something like, "You did a good job there," and I'd go, "Really? Well, I didn't know I was the sort of person that was good at anything." And then somebody else would say something a few weeks later, and I'd begin to think, maybe I'm not such a complete loser. Totally. So it might sound weird that the head of a Commonwealth department is talking about a time only 20 years ago when I felt that I couldn't do anything, but that happens to people. That's what depression does, and you can find your way out of it. But it was a long road back, and it needed a lot of support and tolerance from my wife and from my friends, some of whom were quite worried about me at the time, I think. And I was just lucky that I managed to find a new role somewhere else. But a change of scene. I think there are things that I could have done to help myself. I could have looked after my health more, drunk less, done more exercise, that kind of stuff with hindsight. And I certainly do more of that stuff now, like more exercise and so on, just to keep myself on a good, even keel psychologically. But I think it's really important that senior people who've been through this kind of thing do talk about it.
Totally.
And a lot of times after I've given a speech where I refer to that, someone will come from the audience and say, just quietly, "Thanks for mentioning that, because my brother-in-law's going through that," or "I'm going through that,"
totally,
or whatever. And it gives people a sense that they're not on their own, because we all have this thing that we sometimes think we're the only person that's ever experienced this, and just knowing that someone else has been on that journey helps a bit. Totally.
We still very much navigate a stigma around mental health, and personally and professionally too. People don't want to be seen as vulnerable or not capable, and so people were less likely to.
I used to suffer from really bad anxiety when I was in my 20s, so I used to look at. I was a public servant in the UK, and I used to look at senior public servants, and they'd go off to Parliament and do what we call budget estimates, where you front up to parliamentary committees. And I thought, well, that's my career. I'm never going to do that, because I would just be unable to function. I'd be so anxious and so nervous. And like doing a speech in front of 300 people would have been impossible for me. Even talking in front of 6 people was impossible at one point. But I gradually learned to find techniques. I learned what triggered my anxiety and my stress, and the way I could go about preparing for things which I knew would reduce the likelihood of having those stress triggers.
Definitely.
And that made things more manageable, and eventually I got to the point where I'd done it so often that it became much less daunting than it had been previously. But again, that's it's another mental health and well-being thing. Anxiety, depression, they're different, but sometimes they come together as a nasty little package.
Yeah, definitely. Cousins from the same family that coexist. I just want to bring back to something, and thanks for sharing that, and thank you for bringing that journey to this podcast, because I'm sure people will listen to it and take something away from that perspective regardless. So I want to acknowledge that. And I want to ask you something you touched on earlier around Our Place on Country strategy. And there's really exciting work happening in the Aboriginal space when we talk about country. And I did a little bit of work with Transport not too long ago, but even they were referring to the Our Place on Country strategy and the stuff that the Government Architect's Office had released as well. And so there's this real, I guess, recognition of starting with country and I guess what that means. And I guess for us, for a lot of blackfellas, government has always been associated with, really negative, like deficits, relationships, poor health, poor education, over imprisonment, all that sort of stuff. Whereas this is an actual like real opportunity to step away from that deficits dialogue space and recognise completely from a strengths-based perspective the value and strength that starting with country brings when we talk about managing country, built environment, natural environment, all that sort of stuff. Do you have any reflections on that journey and I guess where you're going now in terms of that perspective and insight that you now have?
Yeah, well, as I said earlier on, that conversation with Jody really brought it together for me that our department, if it was nothing else, was the Department of Country in a way. And that set a really positive agenda, but there were also a lot of frustrations on the way, like frustrations around water rights for Aboriginal communities, frustrations around failure to realise the objectives in the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, etc. And we needed to break down some of those institutional barriers that had stood in the way of achieving really good outcomes. But the way to do that was to engage the wisdom of the Aboriginal people within the organisation, and Jody led that exercise, and that Our Place on Country with that sort of central symbolic motif of having country and culture and language and building out from that to water and housing and the built environment, the natural environment, and having the insight to realise that Aboriginal people have cared for this continent for thousands of generations. And I always think of if human habitation of Australia is a day, then white fellas rocked up at about 2 minutes to midnight kind of thing. So there's all this insight and knowledge which has been built up for so long, and yet we look at many of the problems we face today around things like bushfires and the way in which we destroy biodiversity, and you contrast that with the stewardship that was demonstrated by generation after generation of Aboriginal people over 60,000 years. There was clearly a lot for us to learn. So mobilising to achieve justice in our lifetimes, but also drawing on that amazing sort of cultural living culture and connection to country was something which was really important and inspiring for people. And the most inspiring thing in a way was the way not just the Aboriginal people came together to drive it, but the way it was then picked up by non-Aboriginal staff across the organisation. And then we started saying, part of the problem is that we've got Aboriginal people we're creating ghettos within our own organisation. We've got an Aboriginal strategy and outcomes group here, and we've got Aboriginal people and culture here, one outward looking, the other inward looking. We need Aboriginal leaders throughout our whole organisation. We need Aboriginal people running water, Aboriginal people running Crown lands, Aboriginal people running national parks. And that goes back to the earlier point about power and handing back the power that was unjustly taken.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the embedding Aboriginal cultural knowledge as standard ways of strengthening everything that we do. Yeah,
including, like as you said, the work of the government architect and Dylan Comber-Mary leading that work to when we're building new suburbs or we're building new buildings, let's look at the cultural connection to country which pre-existed colonisation and how we, how whole of Australia benefits from that, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, in the way we go about design and the way we think about places.
Definitely. There's some really exciting stuff happening with the White Bay Power Station, Anzac. And I grew up in Glebe. That's my Aboriginal community that I grew up connected to. And, for us, we had so much memories of Blackwattle Bay as kids. And to be even able to think about what that could mean in terms of thinking about, connection, opportunity, and place is just really exciting. Really exciting times.
And I think, like while I was there, we were starting a lot of stuff. But since I've left, I've been quite struck by how that momentum has continued. Like I was talking to Melanie Hawes, who runs Crown Lands. She was telling me that 500 Aboriginal land claims have been settled in favour of the Land Council in the last 12 months, which is way out. That's more than any point since 1983. And the coverage in the media recently around the handback and joint management of national parks over the next 20 years. Yeah. And I was in Canberra recently, and I mentioned to Jodie Broon that was happening, and she said, "Why is it going to take 20 years?" And I thought, that's good. Maintain the rage.
That's Jodie. That's it.
That's Jodie. So, but you can see that kind of that work that we did is, and even things like the flag on the Harbour Bridge is a small symbolic thing. It's like me wearing a T-shirt, but it's not nothing, right?
It's massive in a lot of ways. Yeah. And so you gave us permission to touch on it. So your journey across DPIE for many of us, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, was quite transformational, and really significant. And I think many of us, and it's funny, like a lot of people use the language of mourning, like when you got, were given the opportunity to head up DPC for that really long time, and but many mob and non-Aboriginal staff was like described it as like mourning, like, oh, we just had this person come in who just brought so much leadership across everything, but there was also real excitement that, for what it said to a lot of us, was like, oh wow, okay, because you came in with this leadership and these values, and we were able to see such a transformation that, although we mourned the loss of you, it was really exciting because we went, hang on, because as much as we loved it, part of it, us were always scared for you, because we haven't come across a lot of leaders that are so supportive of us. And for Aboriginal people in the workplace, we generally tend to get chopped down when we talk, when we put our necks out too much. And so there was always this little fear of us that, like, oh, how this is too good to be true. How long is he going to last? All this sort of stuff. But you stuck around. You had all these amazing outcomes, and then when you got that elevation into DPC, for us it was really reaffirming, because it was like, wow, okay, maybe we don't have to feel so on edge that he could. Can you talk to any of that sort of journey or experience?
So I guess when I started at planning, I remember having a conversation with Tim Reid, my boss, and saying, I reckon I'll have 2.5 years and then I'll get fired, just because you run out of luck and you run out of political friends and all that kind of stuff. It just happens. And so I thought, I'm going to own that, and I'm going to make sure that I don't waste a day. Yep. And that's kind of what I tried to do during that period of time. And then when I got offered the job and accepted the job as head of the public service, I kind of joked with people at the time, saying, I expected to be fired, and I've just been promoted. Yeah. And then I got fired anyway. So I got both outcomes. Yeah. A bit of one, a bit of the other. And that I can't pretend that was fun. But I wouldn't change anything about the approach that I had. And Aboriginal people have. Tanya Koneman joked with me when that happened. She just said, "Are you black?" And I went, "No." And she said, "Because that's the kind of stuff that happens to us all the time." Yeah, exactly. And I went, "Okay, well, if that's a small insight into what it feels like, then that's an education for me." But it was the legacy that I wanted to lead was not hanging around for a long time with the big office and all that kind of jazz, which we talked about. It was that maybe when you're running an organisation, or other people have the opportunity that I was given to step into a role like that, they see that you can be a leader that is in a hurry to change the world and make a difference for some of the most vulnerable people in the community, and wear that with pride. Definitely. And that's the most important legacy, not how long I was in the job or whatever. It's maybe the encouragement or the cover, a bit like wearing a Black Lives Matter t-shirt. It's the kind of, you can be the leader that you want to be, and you may not be around forever, but you can make a difference on your watch. And totally. That's all any of us can ever do, really.
Well, there's absolutely no question that you left a really strong legacy in that period of time. Speak for many people unanimously around that. Thank you. And I think you've made me a better leader. You've made me more conscious of the power of communication and leading with your values, and I guess being confident enough to really lead with them and not compromise them. And I think, coming into the public service 5 years ago, or I didn't have that level of sort of confidence, but your leadership definitely gave me that ability to take that away. So I just want to thank you for that.
And I want to thank you because that time in DPI was the happiest time of my career, and I don't say that in a mournful way. I say it in a joyful way, because no one will ever be able to take that away from me. But totally. It was working with Aboriginal people like yourself that was the thing that was transformative from my point of view. That was what made it the best part of my career.
Definitely. So what's next now? So we know about your new role. You touched on Jodie Bruin and her. Yep. Funnily enough, you both ended up in neighbours again down in Canberra. And
that's right. And I actually sat next to Jodie. I don't know whether I'm allowed to talk about this, but
we can always edit it out.
Yeah, no, you're a mate. I'll talk to you about it. I sat next to Jodie in a big meeting the other day where it was all the secretaries of all the government departments in the Commonwealth.
Yep.
So you got Defence, you got Foreign Affairs, you got all of it, and it was Jodie came in as CEO of the National Indigenous Australians Authority. My Jodie, my mate, and she's sitting there talking about this is thinking around the referendum on the voice. Makarrata. This is I remember we wore the T-shirts that said voice, treaty, truth.
Yeah.
And here's my friend talking to the most senior bureaucrats in Australia about turning that into reality.
Yeah, great.
And she's saying, she's spoken to Marcia Langton about this, and she's spoken to Linda Burney about that, and it was a conversation where you could see that all these powerful people were being led by this Aboriginal Indie woman from the Pilbara. God, it was powerful. And I just thought, this is the right time for me to be in the federal government, when it's not a hard conversation. It's not walking away from the Uluru Statement from the heart. It's actually saying, how do we turn that into reality? And of course it's hard, like closing the gap is hard.
100%.
All the deficit issues that you've talked about is hard, but there is a massive opportunity, which I reckon is really in the next 18 months. Before we run the risk of community losing confidence. If we can get the referendum up, if we can get the voice to Parliament up, if we can get the truth-telling up, then who knows what we can do. It's really exciting. And so there's that going on. I'm also, as I mentioned, right at the end of that incredibly long, boring name of my department that you probably fell asleep halfway through is arts.
Yep.
And within arts, I was talking to one of my deputies, a guy called Stephen Arnott, who spent last week in Washington with a bunch of elders from, I can't remember the clans outside of Adelaide, at the Smithsonian Institute, reclaiming and rehoming ancestral remains to bring them back on country.
I read about that,
and I said to Stephen, how was your week? And he told me about it. He told me how moving it was and how confronting it was in some ways. And I just said to him, it's amazing to be a public servant, isn't it? And to think you'll be able to tell people in future generations that you were there when that kind of really important moment of just beginning to do the right thing and provide some kind of reparation for past injustice. You were in the room when those elders reclaimed those remains, and that's an amazing thing. So I'm in week 3. So I've got a reconciliation action plan, as I mentioned to you earlier, which was produced by the Aboriginal people in the organisation. It's only a small group. It's not 500. I'd love it to be 500. I'm going to work to make it as close to 500 as I can. But it's a big canvas to play with, and lots of opportunities to keep going with that values-based and justice-based agenda.
Yeah, exciting. And shout out to Dixie Crawford, Barkajib woman who's based down in Canberra, who's very much respected as a sort of expert in the rap space as well. So very much worth linking up and connecting with her on country down there.
Right.
She's been a massive support to us since we kicked off Impact Policy, and she's an absolute legend. So I guess we've talked about some of that sort of stuff. We've now looking to the future, thinking about all that sort of stuff. It's week 3. I guess we're moving towards wrapping up. We've talked about some different bits and pieces that we've bounced around with. And I just wanted to ask, I just want to make sure I don't lose. Oh yeah, you talked about the Voice to Parliament.
Yeah.
Are you excited about what's happening down in Victoria with the treaty work? Do you
Yeah.
follow much of that? Do you have like...
I haven't followed it closely, but Victoria's way ahead of where New South Wales has been.
It's exciting.
And it is exciting. And treaty means different things to different people, and the most important thing is what treaty means to community.
Yeah.
So in a way, it's a word, but it's a really important word. And so, whatever justice, reconciliation, whatever those things add up to in the minds of and hearts of Aboriginal people is what treaty should contain. And I think when I look at what's going on in Victoria and I apply that in terms of what we were trying to do in New South Wales, I think about getting serious on native title, getting serious on cultural heritage, getting serious on Aboriginal land claims, and getting serious about handback and joint management of national parks. That began to feel to me like a package which, along with a whole bunch of other stuff and the genuine delivery on closing the gap outcomes, could begin to amount to something which, if you put it all together and you step back from it, you go, okay, well, that looks big enough almost to comprehend the idea of treaty. So it's really important. I said, in acknowledging Gadigal at the beginning, always was, always will be, never ceded by treaty. I'll keep saying that until we've got that treaty.
Totally. Do you see much... I just absolutely lost my train of thought. I was going to ask you something about agreement making, because I think one of the complexities for our communities is navigating that sovereignty at a local level.
Yeah.
Our communities look much different than what they did many years ago, and I think that's one of the journeys that we were on here in New South Wales. But I guess what I want to say actually is close the gap.
Yeah.
So forget what I just said. I've got my train of thought back.
That's right. Good.
Close the gap. Does that sort of framework fall into your portfolio in any different ways? Have you had a chance? Like you said, week 3, it's early days, but is there parts of that are relevant to?
Yeah, there are, and part of the Jodie's presentation to that Secretary's Board, part of it was about the constitutional changes, but also about closing the gap, and regional development is part of that long job title.
Yep.
The arts is part of that, so cultural stuff, very, very significant. Infrastructure, transport, it's all about country, the way we go about things, the respect that we show for land rights, the respect that we show for cultural heritage as we go about those things. So there's quite a few metrics within closing the gap which my department can help with. I've already put up my hand to work with Jodie on improving infrastructure for remote communities across the country, so that's quite an exciting thing which NIAA are leading, and I hope my department can get some great outcomes there. There's quite a lot of resources in regional development, but under the previous government, they weren't really focused on closing the gap type outcomes as much as I think they could have been. So we've got the opportunity to do something there. Part of the problem with closing the gap is there's a lot of data which doesn't exist at the moment, but is really important in terms of demonstrating whether or not we're making progress.
Yep.
In some areas, I think we're going backwards.
Totally.
And that needs to be called out and dealt with. And I think we just need to... part of the reason closing the gap is important is because you've got Capo there bringing together the different peak organisations to say these are the things that matter to community. But we just need to make sure that we don't get lost in the bureaucracy of reporting and all of that kind of stuff, and that we remain focused on what really matters, and what matters to Capo as well is outcomes on the ground.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we had Nat Heath on the podcast last week from TriMob, and he works for the Department of Education, and we've done a lot of stuff together over the years, but he was talking about, he sort of thinks fundamentally Close the Gap in a lot of ways is flawed because it looks at Aboriginal, the metrics for a lot, not all of it, but for a lot of it, around the problem, or the metrics to measure success is around Aboriginal people fitting within Western structures. So you look at like education, for example. So we're doing a lot of work around flexible learning and trying to think differently about how we promote flexible learning opportunities for, Aboriginal communities, but all types of communities where the mainstream education system isn't working. We talk about the sort of ongoing issues in Walgett in terms of the education for whatever reason, that school doesn't appear to be meeting the needs of those kids. Yeah. And how for a lot of our mob, you know, we need like culture. It needs to be trauma informed. It needs to centre social and emotional well-being at the heart of all that. And the reality is that for mainstream schools, they're not built to be able to respond in that way. And so we were having a conversation around that when we talked about health and education and things like that. So I guess for us, we sort of think about like, that's why we try and keep the faith and maintain the rage and all that sort of stuff into the future. But I think there's also a piece for us as community in terms of actually determining what our own solutions are to these, and hopefully being able to seek investment into designing and building the capability to do that.
Yeah. I think the outcomes that I was responsible for in my previous role were around Aboriginal control of land and water, which is a relatively kind of open-ended type thing, as in, you know, you settle a lot of land claims, you hand back national parks, you can, both marine parks and land-based ones, you can make progress. The housing one was the other one. And I guess making sure that we use metrics around housing which actually work for what Aboriginal people need, rather than imposing a very metropolitan Sydney non-Aboriginal perspective on people who might be living in remote communities, might have very different housing needs or expectations, particularly around extended families and that kind of stuff. So just being sensitive to those issues. But there is a government now at national level which genuinely cares about these things, and with a number of Aboriginal people as senior ministers or envoys within that context. So there's the opportunity to shape these things with a lot of goodwill and a lot of desire to make a difference. So it's a positive opportunity we've got at the moment. Yeah,
definitely. And just we're moving towards the end now and wrapping up. Just a couple of, I guess, lighter questions. I guess you were very much known for your, I think, Friday music posts on Workplace. What are you sort of reading or listening to right now? And do you have any suggestions for people that might be listening in terms of what they could be reading?
Well, just read. That's my advice. I found when I was between jobs after Perrottet did me in, I had 6 or 7 months of walking around Sydney Harbour, and I got into the habit of reading again. I think I read 40 novels or something in the first 6 months.
Yeah, wow.
And it's just a fantastic thing to do. And it was all kinds of from different parts of the world, different time periods, and I just love the kind of spiritual aspect of reading and the mindfulness of going for a walk and then picking up a book and being able to escape in different places. The reading came at the expense of the music, because I'm a bloke, so I can't do two things at once. I can't listen to music and read. But you know, my Friday music posts were famous for their kind of 1970s type focus. Some people said I just play music from the 70s. I played 50s, 60s all the way through, but there was 70s was when I was growing up in Britain, and you know, the music that you hear when you're a teenager stays with you for the rest of your life, often for better or for worse.
Definitely. Haunts you sometimes.
But I remember there were a few, like I remember put JK47's Changes, that two-pack cover, and I remember you commenting on that one. And I go, okay, well, that's Sam's giving me the thumbs up on that one. So that was good.
Yeah, definitely. And then I guess finally, any shout outs for anyone that you think that we should be getting on the podcast and having a conversation with?
Yeah, I thought about that. I mean, I think Jodie's always worth talking to, particularly now, to get that insight into what might be going on at the national level. So if you get a chance to talk to her, she's a pretty amazing activist, artist, leader. But the other suggestion is, and these guys might not be interested in this because they don't like to, big note themselves, but the leadership group at the La Perouse, that alliance down there, La Perouse Aboriginal community, the Ingray brothers and the other members of that leadership group, Arlene and so on. I was inspired by them when I first met them, when we did a 2-day thing down on country with them at Kamei, and just the way in which they've gone about things, how smart they are, how clear they are in terms of what communities' priorities are, the way they, they kind of talked to me and Tim Reardon, who was my boss at the time, and they kind of said, you know, we've been around forever and we're going to continue to be around forever. You guys will be here for 5 minutes, but if you can help us, that's good. And they didn't say it in any rude way. It was a very respectful way, and they were always incredibly welcoming. But when they told us the story of that community, and Tanya was a member of that, Tanya Conan was a member of that community, and how things had turned around through Aboriginal leadership and a youth, youthful Aboriginal leadership.
Definitely.
And then we'd sort of sit there as kind of white guys in suits and sort of say, so what about succession planning? We do a lot of succession planning, and they were talking about their young people coming through the Gamay Ranger program and other channels, and they're already saying to their young people, you know, we're going to be in our late 30s soon. Like, that's really old. And you guys are going to be ready to step up. And the sense of pride within that community. So if you can bottle what those guys have got, it's really very, very special. And I'm in awe of those people.
I think that's a great point. We got the opportunity to sit down with Ray a couple of months ago when he's on the board for the Aboriginal Languages Trust. Yeah. And I was interviewing him as part of this comms piece we were developing, and I'd never heard the Dharawal Lapa language story. Yeah. And he shared that, you know, that journey for them, and it was just amazing to see what they'd been able to do but you know, consistent, sustained effort over a period of, you know, over a decade to get to where they've got to today and where they will continue to go. Yeah,
and there's a beautiful calmness and clearness and sense of purpose about the way they go about things, which is really inspiring.
Definitely. No, it's a great suggestion. All right. Well, any final thoughts or points or anything before we wrap up?
No, I miss you, Sam. But it's lovely to be reunited, and I'd be amazed if we didn't do more work together at some point in the future. Who knows when our paths will cross again? But
yeah, definitely.
It was great the first time round, and to repeat the message, maintain the rage.
Yeah, that's
like sometimes I don't need to tell Aboriginal people. Sometimes it's, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and but we've got a big opportunity now to make a real difference in our lifetimes, and I feel very positive and optimistic about that. And keep doing what you're doing, mate. It's great.
Thanks, bro.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cut.